Now, to come to an end in this very long module where we build an entire React app from scratch, I want to make sure that when we click login or sign up, we don't just log to the console, but we instead do log the user in. At least we fake to do so. We can't really log the user in because we have no backend where we would send and validate the data, but at least we can change something on the user interface. For example, if we are logged in, I don't want to see the authenticate button here. Instead, a logout button would be nice. I also don't want to see my places if I'm not logged in, because we can only reach our places if we are logged in. So I want to manage the login status of the user in the React application here, even though we have no full login flow yet. We're missing the backend. Now, to manage that status, we need a brand new React concept, which is called Context. Context allows us to pass data between any components in our application without using props. And that is very useful if you have some general application-wide data like, is the user logged in? So such a central vital question, which affects a lot of parts in your application, which you simply don't want to pass around with props, because that would be madness. You would have to pass props from everywhere to everywhere. It would be super annoying. So context is some behind-the-scenes data transfer mechanism, you could say, and it's built right into React. Now, to use context, I will add a new folder in the shared folder next to components and hooks, and I will name it, well, context. The name is up to you, but I will manage some context in there, so I guess the name makes sense. In there, I'll add an auth-context.js file, and here I will import create context from React, a function React offers. We can call it to create such a context object, which we later can share between our components to share some data behind the scenes. We can initialize it with some initial data. And there I will have a very simple piece of data. I'll have the isLoggedIn key, which initially is false. And I will have a login function, which here is just an empty function for the moment. And I want to have a logout function as well. So a method, to be precise, because it's a function in an object, and that is called a method. So we got isLoggedIn as a property in this object with which we initialize our context, and we got login and logout as methods there. Now I'll store this in a constant auth context, and I will export this constant. So this is my auth context. This is some object we can now share between components, and when we update it, any component that kind of listens to it will also update. However, we're not ready to use it just like this. There is a reason why it's not a regular JavaScript object, but why we have to create it with create context in the end. Because with our context created, we can now go to app.js, so to a place in our application that is on top of our component hierarchy, you could say. An app component is clearly at the very top. It's our root component, if you want to call it like this. In there, I'll import auth context from shared context auth context. And now how do we use auth context there? We wrap the parts of our application that should be able to use that context with it. So here we have this entire router. In the end, I go there and wrap everything, the entire router, with auth context dot provider. So this context, which is created with the help of create context, in the end is an object which has a property which turns out to be a React component, the provider property. So we use this component here and wrap our entire router with it, with auth context provider. Now every component in there, like main navigation and every loaded page and every component used in a page, has access to this auth context. That's one nice thing. Now the provider also takes a value prop. And here we bind the value we manage with our context, which we initialize to this object here. We bind this to a new value. We bind this initial value to a new value. And whenever this value here changes, all the components that listen to our context, so that actively tap into the context, will re-render. Not all the components that are wrapped by Auth Context provider, but only the components where we then will add some code to listen to our context. And now that's the cool thing. We can now manage some state here in the app component and bind this to the value of our context. And hence, when the state here changes and the value changes and this component re-renders because our state changed, we will be able to re-render or update the components that are interested in our context. So for that, let's import use state here in our app component, and also already use callback because we'll need that as well. And then in the app component, let's add a new state, and that is logged in and set is logged in. And with use state, we can initialize this, and at the beginning, let's say this is false. Then I add a login function here, which I wrap with use callback so that it is not recreated unnecessarily to avoid infinite loops. So my dependencies of use callback is an empty array for now. This means this function here will never have to be recreated. Now in there, I simply want to set is logged in to true. And then I will copy that and create a logout function which looks very similar, but where set is logged in sets the logged in state to false, of course. And now value here is bound to a new object where is logged in is set to our is logged in state here, and where the login method is set to our login function here, and logout is set to our logout function. And now whenever this changes, which is the case when is logged in changes, this new value will be passed down to all the components that are interested. And that's the nice thing here.